Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, October 28th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a brand new ABC News Ipsos national poll showing Kamala Harris regaining a larger lead from where she was before after a whole new set of data points have come in across the country showing early voting data in a positive place for Democrats across the race, looking at states like Georgia that have now reached over 50% of their 2020 election turnout. I kid you not, the highest turnout election of the 21st century, the highest turnout election we have seen in over 100 years was the 2020 presidential, in which we saw massive returns for the Democratic Party across a number of battleground states. The higher the turnout was, the better the results were for the party at large. And even though many battleground states were still just as competitive as they historically might be, the results are generally good, where the trend lines show that younger voters are turning out at a higher rate, that the return ballots for Democrats and Republicans are starting to return to their normal of 2016 and 2012, and that election day numbers might actually be quite positive for the Democrats as well. What we're also seeing too is that data points like this one from ABC News and Ipsos, which actually nailed the 2012 election, an election that arguably feels a lot like this one. I think when people ask me, what election does this feel like? A lot of Democrats would say 2008, a lot of Republicans would say 2016. Arguably, this feels a lot more like 2012, where the numbers here are pretty inconsistent. If you remember back in the 2012 election, I know that we didn't cover it because I was in elementary school in the 2012 election, but if you take a look at the data points right up until the election, the numbers weren't actually pretty clear. They weren't clear really at all that Barack Obama would be winning the election in this cycle. You can take a look at a lot of what the prediction maps were, what people had expected for nationwide and statewide polling, and you can see that there were actually some major missteps in it in the final stretch of the campaign. Now, what we saw was that very similar to this cycle, Barack Obama had a pretty substantive lead over Mitt Romney going into September, and then the debates happened, when Mitt Romney did far better than Barack Obama based on what the polls had told us, and generally speaking, by the time we had reached October, we had seen that Mitt Romney had pretty much collapsed Barack Obama's lead to a point where he took a lead and advantage nationwide for about 2 weeks in the 2012 election. Now, if you remember, you will see that the statewide and national polls have tightened a bit. But never once has Donald Trump taken the national lead in the head-to-head generic or popular vote polls, and that's because Kamala Harris has been maintaining a pretty strong advantage over Donald Trump. Now, when it comes down to 2012, and the reason why I find it to be very interesting is because ABC News and Ipsos did things right in 2012. In their final poll, they found that Barack Obama led by roughly 3 points nationwide, and Barack Obama ended up winning nationwide by roughly 3.9%. Now, 3.9% nationally translated to Democrats winning in the Electoral College with 332 electoral votes. In 2020, however, Barack Obama was not on the ballot and Joe Biden was, his VP. In 2020, Joe Biden won by 4.5% nationally and won less Electoral College votes. But now in 2024, the national numbers are looking like they might be closer to 2012 in order for Democrats to win some of these battleground states rather than 2020 or arguably even 2016, where the difference between the national popular vote and some of these swing states was pretty great and a bit of a difficulty for Hillary Clinton to win many of the battlegrounds in a way that it isn't as much of a difficulty for Kamala Harris to do so in some of these data points. And ABC News and Ipsos also does show, similar to some of the other data that we've seen that has shown ties nationwide or 1 or 2 point leads, is that a lot of the growth for Donald Trump's support has come from regions of the country that are largely inconsequential for the overall Electoral College map. Allow me to explain. When you take a look at a state like New York, the most recent New York Times Siena College poll said that in New York City, we see that Kamala Harris is up 33 points. Now, at initial face value, you'd say that's good. But then you compare it to 2020 and 2016, where Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden won it by 40 to 45 points. Massive margins in New York City. Wasn't even competitive, and still it really isn't with 33 points. But it does show that in one of the most populous cities in the nation, the margin of victory there for Kamala Harris is reduced quite a bit in comparison to Biden, to Clinton, to Obama. And because it's a massive chunk of the population, after all, roughly 1 in 12 Americans are from New York State, you're going to find that these voters here do make up a significant chunk of the national electorate. And so that can sort of explain why you'll find polls like the New York Times and Siena College, which actually is a good example. They recently found a nationwide tie between Harris and Trump, and yet in the battleground states, they see that Kamala Harris leads in 4 out of the 7. Well, if this was 2016 or even 2020, Donald Trump would lead in 7 out of the 7, but that's not where we are as a nation. And looking back to that point in 2012, the reason I draw this comparison is because even looking at the statewide polling data points, in terms of the states that were within the margin of error, just take a look at some of the states that were polled. Take a look at a state like New Hampshire. Take a look at a state like Wisconsin, a state like Pennsylvania, State like Virginia, state like Ohio, Florida, Iowa, Colorado, all states that were polling within the margin of error, either had Romney up by a point, Obama up by a point, but well within a reasonable expectation that the map could go either way. And yet Barack Obama won every single state that was in the margin of error with the exception of North Carolina. And yet the expectations were that Romney would get some, Obama would get some, and it would be a total toss-up. And for a while it seemed like that in 2012. But this cycle, this 2024 cycle, feels a lot like this one. Now, I'm not here to say that Kamala Harris is going to win the presidency today. My most recent election prediction gives Donald Trump a second term for the first time since he was running against Biden. So Kamala Harris, is, based on my own electoral map, is at a pretty low point when it comes down to electoral college victory, but is still within a very competitive range. I've decided to take away the swing state status of all of these states to really ground ourselves in what this turning of the tides really does mean in polls like this one nationwide. Because they actually have provided us a really helpful tool here. I love it when polls do these things like the trackers that show you how over time the numbers have changed. And you can see pretty clearly that in August, when it was Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, it had just been announced, the nationwide data point said that it was Kamala Harris at 49, Donald Trump at 45. Then, we saw at the end of the month, Kamala Harris started to expand, 51 to 46. Then again, after that first presidential debate, 51 to 46, okay? About a 5-point difference between the candidates. Then, in early October, it narrowed. And this was in line with a lot of the other data that we were seeing. The national numbers were tightening, the statewide numbers were getting better for Trump, and it didn't seem like the direction was moving in favor of Kamala Harris. But then came out the ABC News and Ipsos poll that was released and conducted through the 22nd that showed Kamala Harris up 4 points nationally. Now, 4 points is not larger than where she was at the end of August or where she was in mid-September, but it's a lot better than where she was in October, and it's a lot early October, and on par with that right after the VP announcement when there was all this hype, all this joy, all this enthusiasm behind the Harris-Walz ticket. And a 4-point lead nationally, might I have to remind us, that lead nationwide does translate to a pretty substantive victory for Kamala Harris should it go correctly. Because unlike 2020, the national popular vote standards for Kamala Harris, because you're seeing states like New York and even regions of California and Florida, huge sections of the population. Here's really something that's really mind-blowing. I guess maybe not if you're from California, but 1 in 8 Americans actually live in California, which is fascinating to say the least. But when you see pockets, areas like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Miami and New York City, major cities, that you are seeing because there is no coordinated effort to get out the vote for Kamala Harris. There is no intentional outreach or advertisement spending or anything like that to run up the margins in these states. What you find is that Kamala Harris in some of these battlegrounds is doing better than what you might expect based on the shifts in some of these safer states. Another good example, too, is the high-quality polls that have been coming out of Virginia that a lot of people look to and say, this is indicative of how the rest of the nation go. But really, no, it's not. The Harris and Trump campaign aren't investing the same amounts in Virginia. In fact, the Harris campaign does not see Virginia as a prime swing state in this cycle. Did Biden see it as a prime swing state in 2020? Absolutely. Did Clinton see it as a prime swing state in 2016? Absolutely. Did Obama see it as a swing state twice? Absolutely. This is the first campaign in the 21st century, besides George W. Bush, who won Virginia by double digits twice, right? You're seeing this is the first campaign where the Democratic and Republican candidates are saying, let's not focus on that state. It has 13 electoral votes. It has more electoral weight than Wisconsin, than Nevada, than Arizona. But it doesn't matter because we know, and we know truly, that Kamala Harris will win that state. So why does that matter? Well, Kamala Harris, some of the polls here are saying that she's only up 8 or 9 points. And thus everyone's saying that's indicative of a national shift. But then we see a poll out of Nebraska's 2nd district that shows Kamala Harris up 12 points as a district Biden only won by 7. And then on the flip side, you see Democrats say this is indicative of a national shift. Granted, I actually put more merit in the poll from Nebraska's 2nd because both campaigns are actively investing in it. The Harris campaign more so. Harris campaign visiting it. But still, Nebraska's 2nd has been on the minds of Donald Trump so much he tried to change the law to deny them of an electoral college vote. But getting through this and really understanding what this turning of the tides, what this change nationally means, what it means for Kamala Harris to start walking back some of these results. You apply the national numbers, a 4-point lead for Kamala Harris. She wins Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. She wins Georgia. She wins Arizona. And she could even win North Carolina. Because unlike Biden, she does not need to win the national popular vote by the same amount because of those vote separations in some of those safer Democratic states that contributed to that 4.5% advantage. But when you take it away, you could still see Biden winning Wisconsin even if he loses some support in New York, right? That's really the point I'm trying to make here. And of course, with Kamala Harris on the ballot, things are different. The race is different. The cycle of, what we talk about, how we talk about it, debates, all these things, everything has changed since she has gotten to the top of the ticket, but in a good way, largely for the Democratic Party. And when we talk about which elections these compare to, 2012, again, is that perfect indication. And I think when this ABC News Ipsos poll came out, it really reminded me of it, because they did the same thing in 2012, as did many of the other pollsters we work with. Now, looking at the data points, the numbers on 538 don't look phenomenal for Kamala Harris. There's no other way to cut that, too. I mean, I do think she's at a point where they really, really do need a substantive rebound to say they are solid on Election Day. Otherwise, it's going to be a toss-up. We are 8 days out, and the current standard, the current expectations in the election is that it is a toss-up, is that it is a close and competitive race. Donald Trump has a 54% chance, according to 538. Again, my own prediction gives him the upper hand in the presidential race. But it's close. It is just as close as it was before, because this is all within the margin of error. Wisconsin, Kamala Harris has a 51 to 49% chance. Are you kidding me? These are odds that are straight out of a movie in terms of how competitive they are. Pennsylvania is 53 to 47. Michigan is 53 to 47. Nevada is 52 to 48. It's like they're giving us nothing. It's frustrating, but it's reality. And so you have to start reading the tea leaves. Early voting data is never going to be consistent. That's why I don't think we should be spending too many videos talking about it. Obviously, there are always good signs for both parties. Some cases, I talked about this in my prediction video, they look good for Republicans. In Arizona, they look good for Republicans. In Colorado, they look good for Republicans. In Nevada, where do they look good for Democrats? In Michigan, in Pennsylvania, and it's a bit up in the air as to who it looks best for in Georgia, because we're starting to see it converge in terms of rural areas versus urban areas. But again, looking at the states, it is a true and total toss-up, which sucks. So that's why we look into these things like early voting data and slight changes in national forecasts, especially those who, granted, 8 years ago, right? Not even 8 years ago. Wow. 12 years ago, we're getting things right. And they're not the same pollsters. They're not the same methodologies. They're not the same people behind it, but still the same organizations trying to poll the same people, trying to poll the same group of electorate. But the numbers here are good so far for Kamala Harris, showing an improvement from 2 to 4. It also helps, too, that the numbers in the battleground states are remaining roughly stagnant. I think the Trump campaign was hoping that given their trend line, they might be up by 2 points in every battleground state by Election Day. That just isn't going to happen. Will they lead in Arizona and Georgia? Sure. But I'm reminded that Kari Lake led by 4 in Arizona on Election Day and still lost that governor's race. So the polls really could be throwing us for a loop. We really just don't know. The numbers in this cycle will either be spot on or have major misses for Democrats or Republicans. And that sounds like it's every scenario possible, but it really is just going to show what we trust the polls for and what we don't. If Donald Trump is on the ballot, do we trust them? If, Kamala Harris is on the ballot, do we trust them? If it's post-Roe, do we trust them, right? All of these different questions need to be answered because we have so many different conflicting pieces of information that tell us the polls are right, the polls are right, the polls are right, the polls are right, the polls are wrong, the polls are wrong, the polls are wrong, the polls are wrong. And so it really throws us for a loop. Regardless, we can still read some information from it, and I think we have thus far. And so in terms of an electoral college forecast, Kamala Harris has a pathway to victory. It lies right in front of us. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Without it, she can't win the presidency, unless she does a clean sweep of the Sun Belt, which is less likely than her winning a single battleground state in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by far, and honestly, less likely than her winning all 3 of the Rust Belt battleground states. But they matter. They matter to the fullest extent, and Donald Trump needs to win a significant chunk of these swing states in order to win the election at large. So I don't know. I think I'm at a point right now where I think Kamala Harris is in a better position than she was 3 days ago. And I know that sounds crazy to say because my prediction was 3 days ago, but this election is 8 days away. So it will be on a day-by-day basis. Do I think last night's rally with Donald Trump in Madison Square Garden mattered? Yes, I do. Pennsylvania has 475,000 Puerto Rican citizens. Now, not all of them are registered to vote, and some of them are under 18. Not all of them will vote in the election. But I'm reminded of how close elections have been in the past and how close they continue to be in our current day and age. Georgia was decided by 11,779 votes. Arizona was decided by a margin of 0.25 percentage point. Wisconsin was decided by less than a point. Pennsylvania itself was decided by a point. And so when it comes down, broken down by the margins, I think Kamala Harris is starting to get to a point where she's making minimal movements on these margins. But when they do come down to just a few thousand votes, that makes a huge difference. These races across the board will be won largely by just a handful of voters that are up in the air right now. The data we're seeing from ABC News and many other networks, too, is that of those who are undecided, they're currently leading towards Kamala Harris, but still want these 8 days to make a decision before Election Day. And I commend them for that because being an informed voter is obviously important. But it is interesting. So we will see how much swaying can be done or will be done by both campaigns. But as of right now, Kamala Harris, based on the new data we've been coming to know and coming to use in our predictions, I think do start to paint a better picture for her than it was 3 days ago, but it's not rosy enough to say that she's in a really strong position for this cycle. If she wins it by a very narrow margin. It's not impossible, may not be the likeliest outcome that she sweeps all the battleground states. That's also something that's possible, but this cycle really is going to be one for the history books for a number of different ways. It'll be very interesting to see if ABC News and Ipsos are right again like they were in 2012, because if they are, Kamala Harris is something to look forward to in January of 2025. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a top left of the screen. There's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.